ladies and gentlemen, to a brand new tutorial series. Yes, I have with me some fingering weight yarn, appropriate needles, DPNs of course, and a rather lovely pattern. Oh yes, the moment has come for me to knit Hermione's everyday socks in fingering weight. Now we thought this would be the perfect opportunity to revisit, re-edit and publish for the first time on Patreon the DPN sock knitting series that Kay put out in 2015. So what I'm going to do is, just like I did with Mr. Bryonybear, we're going to go through every stage together. I'm going to use the tutorial series as my guide. Now within the tutorial series, Kay is actually knitting the rather wonderful sock pattern by Tracy Darby. But I'm, as I say, I'm going to be doing Hermione's everyday socks. So by all means, I'll link Tracy's pattern in the show notes below. I'll also link Hermione's. Show you what mine, Erica. I'll also link Erica's pattern in the show notes below. I'm going to be knitting Erica's Hermione's everyday socks, but you could actually use this as a guide for any DPN socks. And what Kay did in the series, and what she's going to do with me, is take me through every step of making sure I don't get any ladders between my needles and all the other little pitfalls that come when you're knitting with DPNs. Because I'm concerned that with me now going down to fingering weight, my technique needs to be perfect. So just like, as I say, I did with the Bryonybear tutorials, I'm going to use Kay's tuition as my guide, and together we will go on the journey of knitting beautiful, and the yarn actually I should say as well is just gorgeous. It's Nicole C. Mendez, just gorgeous, gorgeous fingering weight yarn. So everything really is perfect, and I think it's time that we got learning.
So we need to cast on 48 stitches, and I knit socks using all 5 DPNs. Some people knit them, I know Susan B. Anderson knits them with 4, so she, effectively you make like a triangle and then use your 4th needle. I prefer using all 5, it just makes more sense mathematically to me to split your stitches evenly rather than oddly, if that makes sense. But again, you will find your own method, but the one I'm going to show you is using all 5 needles. So we need to cast on 48, and I always use long tail. So again, the way that I work out how much of a tail is a very unmathematical way. I just do little pinches, so 1, 2, and 8, and add a bit extra, just for good measure. Let me just get a bit of yarn out so I'm not pulling on that skein. And then we just cast on using the long tail method, 48 stitches. So I have shown this method before as well, so I won't go through it in detail, but you can obviously watch as I do it. So 2, I'll do it fairly slow so you can see 3, 4, 5, 4, 6, 8. And I'll just trim that end. I always think it's better to have a bit too much at the end rather than having to, recast on again when you've not had enough. So that's our 48 stitches cast onto 1 DPN, and now we need to distribute them onto the other 3 DPNs. So what you can do is turn your work and do it from this end, but I always go from the opposite end. So you take a DPN, you push all your stitches to that end, and then we're putting 12 stitches onto each DPN because we've got 48 altogether. So we just transfer them as if to purl. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12. Push it to the middle of your DPN and just let it dangle there. And your next 12. And again push to the middle and just let it dangle. I was terrified when I first did this, because I thought, oh my gosh, they're just dangling there. They're just, what am I supposed to do with those? It was like, I was an absolute panic. And I think I just watched several YouTube videos and just did it really, really slowly and eventually got it. But now, you know, once you've done it a few times, it's kind of second nature. So what we'll do now is, if you lay them down on a flat surface and make it into a square. Now just make sure when you do that none of your stitches are twisted at the corners. You can see it's all lying flat and you've got that sort of, you know, your cast on edge is all facing the same direction. So now all we need to do is join that, and then we're working around. So just turn it round so that you've got, because this, your first cast on stitch is the first one that we're going to knit. So that one needs to be pushed to the end there, ready to knit. And then just make sure you don't knit with your tail end as well. That's really easy to do. Okay, get your other DPM, and then what I do is I took the one here that's got the stitch we're going to knit, I took it behind that DPM, and then pop your DPN, your fifth one, into the stitch, grab your working yarn, pull quite tight so that you don't have a gap, and knit, and you've joined in the round. So you can now pick it up because there's no risk that you're going to twist it. And the pattern calls for, I believe, a 1x1 rib, but I'm going to do a 2x2, but again, entirely up to you. I think if you're a new knitter, doing a 2x2 is slightly easier than a 1x1. So we just work our way across that needle, forgetting about the other ones. It'll be a bit kind of, you know, all the needles are in your way and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't be doing with this. But honestly, once you've done a couple of rows, it gets much easier. So just take your time to do this first row. And like I said, ignore all those flapping needles and just concentrate on the two needles that you're working on. Okay, so I've finished that one, that needle. You now push those stitches to the middle, turn. Here's your next needle, push that to the end. We're going to knit, so the yarn needs to be at the back. And again, I go on top of the needle and pull. This is where you can get ladders. If you don't tension that yarn when you're changing needles, that's when you will get those ladders. So do make sure you give that a nice little pull when you do that first stitch. So again, just work across those two needles, ignoring the ones that are poking in your hands and getting in the way. I think I actually only knit 2 pairs of socks on DPNs originally, and then I discovered Magic Loop, and you know, for the past 3 years I've knit socks on Magic Loop, but then, as you know, if you watch the podcast, I've rediscovered DPNs recently and I just love it. And I think, you know, a change is better than a rest, as they say, and it kind of re-energises you, I think, as well. But I do think it is, in some ways I do think it's quicker, because you're not pushing you know, your needle all the way back and all that. You just quickly change your needle all the way around, and I think it is quicker. So again, just changing needles, so give that yarn a nice little pull. And you will just get into the habit of doing that. It will just become second nature, and you won't even think about it. You know, for the first couple of rounds you'll think, oh yeah, I've got to pull my yarn nice and tight so I don't get ladders. Now, because we're on DPNs, you don't need a stitch marker. I don't find I need a stitch marker, whereas with, you know, when you're doing Magic Loop socks, there is a point when you're knitting the heel flat where you'll need a couple of stitch markers. You don't need stitch markers at all for working DPN socks, which I think is really good. But what you can do when you've knit a little bit is I tend to put one of the locking stitch markers onto this first section just here, so that I know once you've got a bit of the sock going, then it's easy to see where the start of your round is. Because at the minute you know you've done a round because you're back to the tail end. But once you've knit a bit of your sock, that's not quite as, you know, it's not dangling quite there for you to see. So I tend to knit a few rows. Whoops, I didn't bring that yarn to the back. Knit a few rows and then pop in a locking stitch marker on this first section. So we're back to the beginning of the round and we just carry on. Now you will find that even just this second round is much easier than that first round, because you've got a little bit of fabric going now. And you just keep going round and round, and it's so, I just think there's something very, very therapeutic about knitting socks, on DPNs particularly, because there's no interruption really to the flow of your knitting, whereas with Magic Loop there is, because you've got to do the whole, you know, pushing it back onto the needle and everything. But with this, it's so quick, you know, that's the end of that one. Move it round, change your needle and back in, and I just, once you've, you know, that will get even quicker once you've had a bit of practice. The pattern calls for just 8 rounds of knit 2, purl 2, rib. I tend to like things in sort of more rounded numbers, so I think I generally do 10 rows for the rib. But it's up to you. If you like a really long cuff, then just knit it as long as you like, you know. And the other thing I tend to do is I do count rows when I'm doing the first sock. So I'll make a note of how many rows I knit for the rib, how many I knit for the leg, and how many I needed to knit to get to the toe decreases, so that when you do your second sock, rather than having to measure, you know, and make sure it's the same size as the other one, I just go by numbers and I know, right, okay, I've done my 12 rows of rib, I'm now on the leg, you know, and I count rows for that, and I just find that much easier to do, because I do like my socks to be exactly the same. So I will carry on now, and you can see our 2x2 rib is coming through there. So I'll carry on and finish the rib, and then all you need to do is switch to stocking stitch, which obviously when we're knitting the round is just all knits. So we will then knit the leg, and do that again as long as you want the leg.
Folks, I am just getting into the first needle of my second round. So let's just see if I can nail this. I've got to say, this is the most... This is, as it's equivalent to when I first knit with DPNs on sport weight. So I'm so glad, you know, and I'm sat here and I'm so unbelievably grateful now for what I've been doing for the last 10 months. Because if I hadn't done that, there is no way I would be knitting these socks now. I'm finding it tough, just because the yarn is so tiny. The needles are the smallest needles I've ever used, but I think 60% of the toughness is coming from myself, with me worrying about dropping a needle, dropping a stitch, splitting a stitch or whatever. But I've done it. Now I've used a different cast on, and I'll link it below. You can use whichever cast on you want, to be honest. Kay's obviously just demonstrated. Now you see, I always worry that that's twisted, but I'm sure it isn't, because I've kept it flat the whole way and it's knit fine going round. So I've done the twisted German. There we go. And I've done the twisted German because I'm a tight knitter, and of course that gives a looser top. And I also, you know, I made a real effort to not do it tight. My rib is also just slightly different. It's 1 by 1. Kay's just demonstrated 2 by 2. So it's the best of both worlds, I think. You know, you could be doing 1 by 1 like me, or you could be doing 2 by 2 like Kay. But what I was so grateful there on that tutorial is just the techniques for going around those corners. Because I know, you know, when I first cast on sport weight, I had an absolute nightmare with ladders. So I wanted to revisit that technique, which Kay has now done for me, which is brilliant. So I'm now going to crack on, and I'm going to get knitting the sock. So It's going to take me, just bear in mind, this is finger away, it's my first time. It's going to take me just a tiny bit of time just to do that. So the next one in this series will be on the 20th of February. And I will have knit down the leg and we'll be knitting the heel flap. So I'm just so grateful. I am so grateful though for a beautifully written, clear pattern that makes sense. I'm so grateful for gorgeous yarn, and I'm so grateful for Kay's tuition. So on that happy note, get knitting folks, or enjoy the drama if you're just watching to see how I do. I'll be back between now and the 20th with Dan's next sock quest, where I'll be updating you on where I'm at on my overall sock quest. But for the complete lowdown on how I get on with the DPNs and the step-by-step instructions as to how to knit DPN socks perfectly, stick with us on this series. And as I say, I'll be back with part 2 on the 20th of February. I'll see you then.